wanted to start with what the diagnoses were. And she had Dr. Curry, who actually examined Amber Heard for 2 days, for 12 hours, came up with two different diagnoses. One was borderline personality disorder, and the other was histrionic personality disorder. Can you tell us a little bit about both of those, what they are, what they mean?
Absolutely. So first of all, I'll tell you what a personality disorder is. So a mental illness is like a change in someone's baseline functioning. So for example, schizophrenia associated with hearing voices. Personality disorders often get conflated, but they're different. Personality disorder is ingrained. So it's when an individual has character flaws in themselves, which make it difficult for them to get on with people, to hold down jobs, to interact with the world, etc., etc. So that's in general what a personality disorder is. And then there's lots of different types. Borderline is probably one of the most well-known. It's also called emotionally unstable personality disorder. So the features are that people have, with this diagnosis, they have this fear of abandonment. They'll do almost anything to not be left alone. They are quite impulsive. They often self-harm. They're often quite impulsive in their acts, and they do things that can be quite harmful, like spending lots of money. They have what we call a shallow affect. So that means that they don't really feel emotions. Well, they don't keep onto emotions for a very long period of time. And they tend to have explosive kind of arguments and turbulent relationships. So already I'm sure you would acknowledge that some of those things do describe Amber Heard. Just a quick tangent from my experience of working with offenders. It's usually we have people that are antisocial personality disorder. People with borderline, they don't tend to want to offend. So they're not career criminals, but just at that moment, they get so easily provoked that they lose their temper and they end up doing something they regret, as opposed to antisocial people who kind of intentionally offend. That's part of their lifestyle. So that's how I'd categorize borderline. Histrionic is basically what it sounds like. So it's somebody that loves being the center of attention. So somebody who's got a histrionic personality disorder is really open, really sensitive to criticism, always trying to be the center of attention. And they often manipulate those around them to be the center of attention. So to be specific, if it serves them, they will be your friend if you're popular or if they use you to get into a social circle. And once you're no longer useful for them socially, they'll dump you. And they tend to be very sensitive towards criticism, and they constantly examine their own self-worth. So for example, you and I are doing this podcast here right now, right? So if one of us had histrionic personality disorder, not only would we try and dominate the podcast, but we would be obsessed afterwards about how we came across. So we would phone up all our friends, constantly wanting reassurance, that kind of thing.
So are they often found together? I mean, is it common to have two different personality disorders, or is it normal that you would just have one?
It's definitely a mixture, Lee. So you can have comorbid personality disorders, absolutely. And I suppose the other thing that we need to acknowledge is there's a lot of overlap between some of the symptoms and some of the features. Borderline is very common. Histrionic is much rarer. So in general, histrionic is seen less often, but specifically with offender groups, with the patients I work with, it is also not seen very often because people who are histrionic, a bit like people who are narcissistic, they're sharp enough to know what works well for them. So somebody with borderline, they can't contain their emotions. They get angry very easily. Somebody with histrionic personality disorder would not want to be tied up in the criminal justice system. They wouldn't want to offend. They wouldn't want to be arrested. They wouldn't want to end up in prison because it ruins their lifestyle. And they're all about their own sort of ego and lifestyle, whereas somebody with borderline won't be able to contain it.
All right. I want to go through some of the evidence at trial and talk about whether or not that fits, doesn't fit with the two different diagnoses. But even before we get to that, I want to ask you about a question that I got from several different people when I asked people to submit questions, and I had it too. So I want to ask you about this. A lot of people were wondering about narcissistic personality disorder. I think that's one that people have heard of before. They have sort of an idea of what it is. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that is and why you think, from a psychiatric point of view, maybe Dr. Curry didn't talk about it, didn't diagnose it?
Yeah. So narcissistic personality disorder is actually very similar in ways to a histrionic personality disorder. I suppose the difference is that histrionic personality disorder, you always have to be the center of attention. Whereas with narcissistic personality disorder, you think highly of yourself, but you don't necessarily need to be the center of attention. So somebody who has a narcissistic personality disorder has very grandiose ideas about their own self-worth. So they think they're extremely witty or talented or pretty or handsome, and they will dominate a conversation. So if you speak to somebody with NPD, I'm sure we've all met people like this, they will only talk about themselves, won't ask you any questions about yourself, and will turn the focus of everything towards themselves. And they're also slightly paranoid, I would say. So they're just like people with histrionic PD are quite sensitive to criticism. A true narcissist will see every kind of social interaction as either being positive towards them or them being praised, or neutral, in which they would view as a negative. So if somebody doesn't shower them with praise, then they take that personally. So it's all about themselves, really.
Okay. I want to throw into a thought from the legal perspective about why that might not have been discussed. One of the things that Dr. Spiegel did, Dr. Spiegel was Amber Heard's own expert witness in the psychiatric arena, but he had not actually examined Johnny Depp. He threw out at one point that Johnny Depp had narcissism, was narcissistic. He couldn't really diagnose it because he had never seen him, but he talked about that. So since he could not talk about it, having not diagnosed it, if Dr. Curry had talked at length about a diagnosis like that, she would have basically been the only testimony to support what it meant and what Dr. Spiegel was talking about. So I wondered if legally there was some decision made that we're not going to cover that. I don't know whether she ever even diagnosed it.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I'd say about that. First of all, using the term that somebody is narcissistic is very different from diagnosing them with a narcissistic personality disorder. So any personality disorder means, as I kind of mentioned before, that the traits are so strong and so pervasive that they affect the way that person functions. So somebody with a personality disorder struggles to get on with people, struggles to work, etc., etc. Just saying the word narcissistic in itself is just an adjective, right? You could really say there's no kind of degree or limit to what that means. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's quite easy to say somebody's narcissistic as a personality trait, just as you could say somebody's confident or somebody's charming. But that's very different from saying they actually have a personality disorder, which means they're so narcissistic that they literally can't get past that point. So I don't know if that was intentional. I mean, I've made a video, as I'm sure you've seen, about Dr. Spiegel in general. I don't think particularly talented as a clinician or as an expert witness. I don't know if that was intentional, that he was trying to just slip that adjective in on purpose so that people might confuse it with the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, or if it was just the fact that he was just using it kind of as a throwaway comment. Could you say that Johnny Depp is narcissistic? Yeah, you probably could, in the same way that you could probably say that most A-list Hollywood actors are probably narcissistic to a degree. They probably feel themselves. They probably are showered with praise everywhere they go. They probably have men and women throwing themselves at them. They probably have a lot of attention. So I would assume that most have a degree of narcissism, but that's not a psychiatric diagnosis. That's just a character trait that they have. And to answer your question about whether you can diagnose somebody, remotely or from afar without assessing them, I mean, I would say not a formal diagnosis, no. In my YouTube channel, I sometimes make judgment calls about people based on video footage or about reports of them in the news or some of their behavior, just like we're doing now with Amber Heard. But that's very different from a YouTuber making a informal kind of spot diagnosis versus a formal diagnosis that's used in court. So I would argue that it's completely unreasonable to try and make a formal diagnosis of somebody for a court case if you've not met them in person and if you've not diagnosed them specifically.
One of the things that was talked about during the trial was something that's an American version that you may not have in the UK, the Goldwater rule, the idea that there shouldn't be any sort of armchair diagnoses, is what I'll call them. Armchair diagnoses of what it is that somebody has when you just see them talking on the news. And apparently it came from people talking about Barry Goldwater when he ran for president and talking about their opinions about what diagnoses he might have. So do you have anything similar to that in the UK?
Yeah, so I choose to ignore it, probably to my own career detriment. So it is a rule that was, I think, instigated by the American Psychiatric Association. Our equivalent, which is called the Royal College of Psychiatrists here, supports it. So if you go on the website, it says that we support the Goldwater rule in media kind of analyses, but it's not a hard and fast rule. So you wouldn't get in trouble if you kind of broke that rule. But again, I think I'd like to think that the general public are intelligent enough to know when somebody like myself is making is got a degree of speculation and is talking in a broader sense versus somebody that's actually formally diagnosing somebody, either in the context of a trial or for some sort of medical report, or that actually goes in their medical notes. So I think there's a big difference.
Let's talk about the psychiatric witnesses who testified at the Depp Heard trial, because they came from sort of a spectrum. You had Dr. Spiegel, who had not met with or done anything. You had Dr. Curry, who was more intimately involved with doing diagnoses of Amber Heard. And then, of course, you had Dr. Curry, who was Johnny Depp's side of that and who had also met for 12 hours, I believe it was, with Amber Heard. On the spectrum of that, which of those would be closest to a typical kind of analysis you would do?
So for me, I would see, right. So the one thing that I think is really important that I think was almost missed or ignored in the Amber Heard Johnny Depp situation is reading the medical notes. So when I'm seeing somebody who, so let's say, take an extreme case. So I see about 3 or 4 murder cases a year, and somebody's been accused of murder, and maybe their solicitor's suggesting that they've got some sort of psychotic illness or some sort of depression. The most important thing to me would be to look at their medical notes to see consistency, because anybody can say they're hearing voices. Anyone can say that they're, a bit depressed. So I think that was kind of missed in this case. Everybody's talking about, even the psychiatrist who I thought did very well, like Dr. Curry, did it from assessing that person only. There seemed to be very little acknowledgement of their medical records. So to answer your question, I think that's the most important thing. But if you're actually talking about diagnosing somebody from a personal assessment, then absolutely, the more time you spend with them, the more accurate it's going to be. So if you're talking about Dr. Spiegel trying to diagnose Johnny Depp just from watching video clips, in my view, that's completely invalid. But the other thing, which is a slightly uncomfortable truth, is that diagnosing somebody for a case, especially a defamation case, where it's not about severe mental illness like hearing voices, when it's actually about their personality traits, is in itself how do I put this nicely? I think it's a bit of a muddy area. It's a grey area, because you're not likely to present absolutely truthfully if you're the subject, because you've got an agenda, right? If you're presenting to a psychiatrist because you've got a mental health problem and you want treatment, then you're going to be honest, because otherwise why indulge in the process? But if you're in a multi-million defamation trial, then I think it's fair to say that there's a risk that you've got an agenda to appear a certain way.
On the legal side, the province of the jury. One of the things that is carefully guarded is everybody's got a role in a trial, and the jury's is to find the facts and to find who's telling the truth and who's not. And that's always carefully guarded. The judge can't get into that. On appeal, they're not going to oversee that or correct that. That's always something that's going to be preserved for just the jury. So I could understand that because she had claimed she had PTSD, there was a right to look at her records and to look at her and to analyze her and see whether or not she really had PTSD.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can quite confidently say that a psychiatric or a psychological expert absolutely should not comment on A, if somebody's guilty or innocent, say in a criminal trial, and B, whether the subject is telling the truth or not. You can, and I've certainly seen this myself, you can highlight if there's inconsistencies. So because you don't want to sway the jury or even the judge in any particular way, you can't call somebody overtly a liar, but you can say something like there are inconsistencies in their history. So they said that they, suffered from domestic abuse from their parents, but the social service records don't support this. Or if it's about symptomatology, they say that they're suffering from PTSD, but they've not got any reported flashbacks. They don't have hypervigilance, which is always being on edge, some of the core symptoms of PTSD. So you can say that there's a disconnection between the evidence and what you're seeing clinically, but you can never say directly whether you think somebody's telling the truth or not, because that is a factual matter for the court, for the judge and the jury, not for a psychiatric expert.
Yes. And I would say Dr. Curry walked that line. I mean, she did not go that far. There were some comments that I had written down, that someone with borderline personality disorder might make up stories to get attention, might take on a victim or a princess role. Those were things that were said, or might suddenly be an avenger of injustice or be thinking that their partner is a terrible person.
All of those statements that you just said, that Dr. Curry said, are technically true. Somebody with borderline might do those things, but some are more associated with borderline than others. So making up a story to get attention, that is less likely to me, or let me rephrase that. Of all the patients that I've seen with borderline personality disorder, which must be several hundred by now in my career, very few of them have made up stories to get attention, whereas more of them have done what we call splitting. So they either idealize or hate individuals. So it could even be the same individuals. They can get on really well with somebody one moment or one day, and then, just flip out and just not get on with them and show hostility towards them and then flip back. That is very typical of borderline. Lying, I wouldn't say that is maybe slightly more typical than the average person, but it's certainly not a core feature.
She was talking in generalities about what a person with borderline personality disorder might do, might think, might say. And then the thing that I think that made that particularly effective was it dovetailed so directly with what the evidence showed about what had actually happened in the relationship between Amber and Johnny.